Come along, let's go to bearing. Come along, let's go to bearing. Won't you come
Syracuse has a long
along?
history from when the Iroquois
Let's
first
go to
invited French
bearing.
missionaries to set up a mission near Onondaga
Bend
Lake to its rapid development of the salt mining industry, for which we earned both our city name of Syracuse and our nickname, the Salt City. Clinton Square was a central hub of the Erie Canal, making it a well-traveled route. Our population grew from 22,000 in 1850 to over 100,000 by the turn of the century. Industry was booming, and we were in the middle of everything. In the early years of segregation, the North was known to be anti-slavery, and Syracuse was a center for those who were making their way to freedom. Though there was no set route for freedom seekers to take, coming through Syracuse was a welcoming option, following Route 11 and using the Finger Lakes as a directional to freedom.
There was a sense of the way that, because of the topography and stuff, to come up Route 11 was a way that you could get to central New York and then go around Ontario.
When you had to walk, as many people did, you used every kind of transportation system that everyone else does. Rivers, canals, roads, trains. And when the transportation was mostly by land or water, people would walk up basically Route 11 and up through the Finger Lakes that point kind of like arrows into Canada, and up through Syracuse to Oswego or Syracuse to Auburn. After the railroads came through in the 50s and the railroad lines consolidated into a real national system, that's what people escaping from slavery would often take. And there were two big routes. One of them was most of the people here came from Maryland, the Eastern Shore, or Virginia, and they come up to Philadelphia, they take the train to New York City, then the train to Albany, Syracuse, Rochester, and Niagara Falls. Or the other route was coming up from Harrisburg to Elmira, and then they take what was called the Canandaigua Niagara Falls Railroad west to Niagara Falls. So it kind of shifted both the methods of transportation and the way they did it. Trains became so important, not underground trains, but rail trains, just like with everyone else. Yeah.
Even though most freedom seekers did not settle here, some did, and there were many important people and places in Syracuse that made the Underground Railroad so successful. In 2007, Syracuse unveiled 11 signs to commemorate and teach the local history of the Underground Railroad. Today, you can take a walking tour of the Syracuse Freedom Trail or even take a ride on the Yellow Fellow to explore the stops in and around the city. One of the most famous stops on the Syracuse Freedom Trail is the Jerry Rescue Monument located in Clinton Square, which was once a central hub for travel and the Underground Railroad. William Jerry Henry was arrested on October 1st, 1851, under the Fugitive Slave Law during the Liberty Party's anti-slavery convention. Jerry was arrested, held and tried on this spot despite Syracuse being an abolitionist city. An attempt was made to rescue him, and Jerry nearly escaped, still bound by chains, but was unsuccessful. Later that evening, however, a huge crowd came to assist in his rescue, and after a U.S. Marshal jumped from the building to escape the mob, Jerry was surrendered to the abolitionists. Jerry was carried out on the shoulders of his rescuers, paraded through the street. Someone yelled, "Fire!" to allow room for his escape carriage to get through. As Jerry was moved, he was unshackled by Peter Lilly, who worked for African-American lawyer George Vachon, whose offices were in the Dana Block on the corner of Warren and Water Streets. Jerry was successfully hidden at the Hotel Syracuse for a few days, then was aided to Canada to become a free man. In all, 26 people were arrested for their part in the Jerry rescue, but well-to-do sympathizers such as U.S. Senator William Seward bailed out many of the accused. Enoch Reed was the only person convicted in the Jerry rescue. He waited 2 years for trial and died while waiting on appeal. This spot on Lodi and Butternut Street in the 15th Ward was where Enoch and his wife Jane lived, now a Rite Aid. This is one of the areas in the 15th Ward that was demolished in the 1960s during Syracuse's urban renewal, when they thought it was better to demolish and rebuild rather than preserve these historic sites. Another house belonged to William and Mary Edwards, who had purchased a vacant lot from the Logans and were one of many second-generation African Americans who settled in Syracuse. There are a few historic African American residences that still stand. At 204 and 206 Catherine Street stands the former home of Mary Robinson, and at 35 Catawba Street is the Allen Schneider House. The Allen family was known for assisting in the Jerry Rescue, for their active participation in the Underground Railroad, and as one of the first African American families on record to own a house in Syracuse. 9 people, including Reverend Jermaine Logan, were charged and fled to Canada. The Townsend Block was renamed the Jerry Rescue Building, which was later replaced with a monument. The day after the rescue, Gerrit Smith wrote, "We rejoice that the city of Syracuse, the anti-slavery city of Syracuse, the city of anti-slavery conventions, our beloved and glorious city of Syracuse, still remains undisgraced by the fulfillment of the prediction of the satanic Daniel Webster." Daniel Webster, the current Secretary of State, only months prior to the arrest of Jerry Henry, stood on the balcony of the Courier Building and proclaimed that the fugitive slave law would be enforced. Following the Jerry rescue on October 4th, there was a meeting at City Hall where players such as Samuel May and Reverend Logan made resolutions to fight the unjust law. They created a vigilance committee to organize resistance to the fugitive slave law and came together again on October 11th to sign a petition to Congress to repeal the law. Daniel Webster, who Smith called an infamous enemy of the human race, claimed that the fugitive slave law would be upheld even in cities who were against it, like Syracuse.
Webster was here, made a speech saying, all of you Syracusans had better start paying attention because the federal law says that you can go to jail, we can take all of your property. There are some really stiff penalties, and that didn't work.
Mm-hmm. Yes, they picked out Syracuse, the federal government did, to try to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act. And they said, we're going to enforce it here during the next anti-slavery convention if need be. And that was when they captured William Jerry Henry. And they lost, basically.
Reverend Jermaine Logan was a fugitive slave from Tennessee who assisted nearly 2,500 runaway slaves between 1851 and 1859 and publicly admitted his involvement in the Underground Railroad without regard for his own freedom.
What's amazing about Syracuse is Jermaine Logan and Carolyn Logan would put notices in the paper, if you need help, come to 293 East Genesee Street. And Logan would, over 6 feet tall, was very visibly refusing, come, if you want me, come and get me, and you'll never take me alive. I mean, it was very in your face, open by the 1850s, and that's a real challenge to what we all thought was the truth.
Logan was raised by his mother and slave master father until he was sold to his uncle. He experienced frequent beatings, and on one occasion, his uncle wedged a wooden handle in his mouth, causing permanent injury and a speech impediment. One night, his mother lit a barn on fire as a distraction so he could survive a brutal beating. Then, after witnessing his siblings being sold and mother beaten, he decided to run away. Logan's trek to freedom was an arduous journey through 100 miles of wilderness until he came upon an African American community in Indiana. He later traveled to Canada and then to Rochester, where he began his studies and joined the abolitionist movement. He became a reverend for the African Methodist Episcopal Church and eventually moved to Syracuse in 1841. His ministry kept him on the road until he moved back to Syracuse and purchased land from Gerrit Smith in 1846. By this time, Logan had made several anti-slavery speeches and was deeply involved in the abolitionist movement. Logan spoke to Syracusans, urging them to keep the city an open state and resist the fugitive law, stating, "I don't respect this law, I don't fear it, and I won't obey it." Later, after assisting in the Jerry rescue, Logan set up a safe room in his basement at his East Genesee Street residence and assisted over 200 fugitive slaves each year to their freedom. Logan was one of the few station masters who kept detailed records of his efforts and advertised his safe house in the newspaper for those seeking assistance. It is obvious why Logan was given the nickname the King of the Underground Railroad. Thanks to the efforts of Dr. Judith Wellman and the Preservation Association of Central New York, there was a push to create a freedom trail in Syracuse with informational signs as indicators. These signs were placed at 11 approved locations throughout the city that had sufficient evidence to be designated as part of the Syracuse Freedom Trail. The National Park Service has established an underground railroad network, and Onondaga County was the first to establish a county-wide underground railroad commission. After acquiring a small grant from New York State Archives, Dr. Wellman and Dr. Milton Cernett completed a historic context statement in support of National Registry recommendations. The Preservation Association of Central New York also received a small grant and led Beth Crawford, Jay Evangelisti, and others to investigate and survey the historic sites related to the Underground Railroad in Syracuse. Syracuse was known as the Grand Central Depot and the Canada of the North, largely due to the activities of Germaine and Caroline Logan, who raised money, collected clothes and food, and provided transportation and employment to freedom seekers. By the mid-1850s, the Logans had the support of the New York Central Railroad Station, located only a few blocks from their home. One of the biggest challenges was the demise of the 15th Ward. Most of the oldest homes in Syracuse were destroyed, and many records and artifacts were lost. We must take an interest with regard to the remaining historic sites and ensure that they are preserved, marked, and registered. Two important stops on the Syracuse Freedom Trail include the Wesleyan Chapel in Columbus Circle and the Plymouth Church. The Wesleyan Chapel is most famously noted for having a series of 7 faces carved into the basement walls. These faces were most likely carved by freedom seekers taking shelter in the church basement. The Plymouth Congregational Church hosted many abolitionist conventions, and its members were associated with the escape of Harriet Powell and the rescue of Jerry Henry. An important aspect of the Underground Railroad is the diversity of those who were involved. European Americans in Syracuse played a large role in the aiding of freedom seekers. It is not surprising that the sites belonging to European Americans are the most well preserved. George and Rebecca Barnes, who used their resources to raise money to further the cause, including bail money for those involved in the Jerry rescue, lived on James Street. George Barnes was also one of the 13 members of the Vigilante Committee. The Harriet May Mills House is another example of European American efforts for abolitionist activities and women's rights. Her parents were known social reformers, and Harriet was named after Samuel May. On record, there were only 11 people in Onondaga County that were owned as slaves, one of whom lived in the Sabine House on Academy Green in Syracuse. The Sabines represent a transition towards anti-slavery. William Sabine's sons both became active abolitionists, even inviting anti-slavery speakers to give speeches on their front lawn. Joseph Sabine was the commissioner in charge of hearing Jerry Henry's case. Though never given the chance due to his infamous rescue, it is thought that Sabine would not have sent Jerry back to bondage.
We were not having great success in the community in general with preservation. Syracuse is notorious for its incredible architecture, and there have been many people who have come into town, hired by universities, industry, and communities to talk about the city of Syracuse and how it could be marketed more successfully. And inevitably, the reports come back and list one of the greatest assets is not so much the weather, but the so much incredible architectural history that we have. And it is of such a great, so many years of experience and so many kinds of houses, from metal houses to log cabins to marvelous estates. And unfortunately, the community does not appreciate that. I don't know that they don't necessarily appreciate it. It's not something that they find is important. I think it's really, really important with the way things are in 2017 about so much national discussion about who deserves what and where people should be and what they're allowed, and generally not understanding and remembering, as Judy said, about the Declaration of Independence and who we are. And it's terribly important not to forget that. This is a classic example of people making profit on other people. All of that connections are really important. My connection with Judy, my connections and my relationship with the board, all of those things make this so human. It just so happens that Judy and I both feel this way about buildings and sites.
Yes.
It's a really emotional thing. There's an economic side to this. Every year the numbers for eco and historical tourism has increased every single year. And that's why as Dr. Judy Wellman mentioned, the national Freedom Trail sites, both women's history and et al., is becoming an economic factor because there are people that are going on the Freedom Trails and want to experience and understand what went on. And that also has some value, not just philosophically and religiously and important, but also financially. It was a lot of fun. It was a lot of work, but not a fraction of the work or the struggle that people did to get to freedom.
Roll on, thou joyful day, when tyranny's proud sway, stern as the grave, shall to the ground be hurled, and freedom's flag unfurled, shall wave throughout the world o'er every slave. Trump of glad jubilee, echo o'er land and sea, freedom for all. Let the glad tidings fly, and every tribe reply, glory to God on high, at slavery's fall.